One in the front row, second row. Come on up.
Present. You are presenting. Microphone is picking up here in theory. Hopefully it's recording. Huh?
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I have the coveted after lunch spot, so this should be pretty interesting. Before we get started, if I could just get a quick show of hands of how many people have taken basic pricing training before? About a quarter of it. Okay. So for you guys, just so you know, this is probably going to be a refresher. There were a couple people who asked me what this was about, and once they knew it was a refresher, there were some other things that they wanted to see. So not encouraging you to leave, just setting that expectation. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Ellison. I work in Central Office Pricing Policy and Tools Division, and today we are going to be talking about pricing training. Now, GSA owns over 300 million square feet of leased and owned space. And because of our economies of scale, we are really able to offer you both our expertise over a breadth and depth of services. The pricing desk guide is the policy which we use on how to charge you for all that space. Now, we have a lot of material to get through. I am hopeful we can do it in our allotted time. If you have burning questions, please let me know during the presentation so we can try to address them. But otherwise, if I can't, if it's really agency specific or too detailed, we're going to get your information so we can get that answer to you. Okay? Yes, already.
Slides be available to you?
Yes, all the slides from all the presentations, once the forum is over today, will be uploaded and available to everybody. You're very welcome.
Recording each session. We're recording each of the sessions.
All right, so our agenda for today, or at least for the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to give you a little bit about our legislative background, and really that's how we have our authority to do what we do. Then my goal is when you walk out of here to make sure that you can describe the content of an occupancy agreement, I'll also call it an OA, and know why they are important. Also to be able to explain shell, tenant improvements, and the difference between the two, as well as to understand how the TI allowance is determined. I also am going to be talking about operating costs. And lastly, I want to get you familiar with your tenant agency rights. So now a little bit about the legislative foundation. When we talk about pricing, there are three pieces of kind of primary legislation that we're going to look at. First is the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act of 1949. And basically that just directs GSA to charge for space and services that approximate what you would find in the commercial marketplace for the same amount of space and services. The next piece of legislation is the Building Amendments Act of 72. And what that basically does is creates the FBF, the Federal Buildings Fund. And how that works is the Congress will appropriate money to you, the agency, for rent. Then the agency pays GSA the rent. And then Congress has given us authority to use that rent for our different budgets that we have. The last piece of legislation is the Economy Act of 1932. And that basically created the PBS fee. And what it says is that it mandates all federal agencies to be fully reimbursed by their customer agency for the overhead and administration expenses that we provide to them. So that's kind of like the background in a nutshell. Another key component of pricing foundation is just how we charge for our space, both federal and lease space. So in federal space, rent is based on an appraisal or return on investment, which you'll also heard referred to as ROI. This is the basis for which GSA provides you the rent estimate for new and continuing occupancies. And at a minimum, we're going to have a fair annual rent or FAR appraisal done every 10 years for that rate. Yes.
So the appraisal from the PBS is an appraisal that GSA standards dictate as opposed to the state that the property is located in? Why is that?
Yes, but we don't do the appraisal. We contract a third party that does the appraisal.
But they follow your standards, not the standards of practice of whichever state.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Use that for else. The guidelines that all appraisers have to use,
It's not set by GSA. It's a separate standard.
and they adhere.
For example, below grade space is typically 40% of the full value, but in GSA, the PBS dictates that if it doesn't have protuberances or some other means encumbrance that would not allow it to be converted to office space, then it's charged full office space. When in fact, it's underground, doesn't have any windows.
So just so everyone can hear, this gentleman is questioning why some of the standards, in what document are you referring to that this?
PBS.
No, the one you said it doesn't adhere to.
Well, the state standards for.
Statewide, PBS doesn't follow state standards.
State standards for appraisals.
I am not an appraiser, but we do follow, it's not a PBS standard that we follow. It is, and so what I can do, Ava, if you could take note of that, and that can be a question that we can include in our responses.
Sets what the return on investment is. In other words, if you guys, if GSA are federally owned one, okay, if rent is based off of that, how do you set your return on investment? Who sets that?
We do, and it's 6%.
Okay.
Okay. Now, in lease space, the rent is going to be a pass-through of the underlying lease that is negotiated between us and the lessor, and we add a fee. That fee is 7% for cancelable space and 5% for non-cancelable space, and we'll talk a little bit more about that fee later on. And now we're going to go to the occupancy agreement. I'm going to refer to it as an OA, which I'm pretty sure most of you probably do as well. Now, what is the occupancy agreement? Well, it's up there. I usually wait before I put up that slide, and I try to get some audience interaction. But so your occupancy agreement is going to be kind of like the complete statement of the business terms between us, PBS, and you, the agency. And it also serves as the billing document. And as such, it's going to cover the financial responsibilities of ourselves as well as the tenant agency. But it's not a contract. Since we're both government entities, we technically can't have a contract between ourselves. But it is a formal agreement that we would expect both signing parties to follow. Now, before I go to the next slide, I just want to touch on really quickly, there's basically 3 types of OAs. We have what you call a pro forma OA. That's going to be the first OA that you receive. It gives you an estimate of your rent charges. This pro forma OA will change as the project progresses, and as appropriate, additional iterations will be sent to you. Some agencies like to see a pro forma anytime anything changes in the project, and other agencies say, you know what, unless it's increasing my rent, I really don't want to see anything. The second type of OA we have is the billing OA, and this is the final OA after the project has been completed, and this is going to tell you what your rent is going to be. The last type of OA we have is something called an administrative OA, and these will typically come to you with some type of cover letter designating that you don't need to sign this. This is for information purposes only, and usually it has to do with things like joint use charges or antennas or parking. So why is an OA important? Well, for one, it's going to keep you in the know about what you're being charged. And it also helps ensure that we are not incurring financial obligations which you, the agency, have not agreed to pay for. In that vein, the goal is to also help eliminate any types of rent disputes or appeals, because we have this document that we're starting out with. Everything is laid on the table, so both parties should know where we're coming from and what's being charged. And in fact, with prospective submissions, you actually have to have a signed OA before you can move forward. Okay, now I got it together. Does anybody know the 4 types of an OA, the 4 parts of an OA, before I move to the next slide? Anybody want to take some guesses? Anybody familiar with the OA at all? Yes. Well, those are definitely on the OA. I was more referring to the actual structure of the OA. So we have the description of space and services, which is self-explanatory. It's going to give you your address, your rentable, your usable square footage, as well as your OA term, which is essentially the time that you have the right to occupy that space for each space assignment, specific duration. You also have your clauses. We have several types. We have a standard clause, so your rent commencement, your financial clause, your move policy, those are all standard clauses and would be on every type of OA. But we also have some other types of clauses. We have ad hoc clauses. We have agency specific clauses. So those you will also find on your OA. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the signature page. The OA signature is required before we incur any type of significant cost. And that is to pursue a project or procurement. So for example, in a lease, that would be when you, anybody, award a lease contract. In government space, that would be, or in federal space, excuse me, that would be when we purchase a site or we award a design contract, okay? If a tenant agency later backs out of that signed OA, PBS does reserve the right to seek reimbursement. An OA would also be required anytime an agency expands or reduces your space, because that's going to affect your rent, as well as when certain services are added or removed, because again, that could affect your rent. Yes. Yes.
Just for clarity, because I had this back and forth with GSA a lot about why aren't they signed? Maybe it's administrative ones have to.
Mm-hmm.
But which ones have to be
Signed. So
signed by GSA?
So there's a comprehensive list of when they do require a signature and not on this page, but what you'll find on the slides is there's a citation at the bottom that will take you directly to that slide to find out the full version of when it needs to be signed. But if you're getting an administrative OA, it should have on the front cover, administrative only, you don't require a signature. So if it's, that should be there. And like I said, anytime if you are expanding your space, if you're reducing your space, those are definitely circumstances where you would need to get a signed OA. But I would encourage you to consult the pricing desk guide. We have it online and I have the link in there to give you specifics.
That would be helpful because the auditors
Signed, right. And again, if you're getting an OA that needs to be signed, our signature should already be on it when it gets to you. Okay. Let's see. The financial summary page obviously is going to have your things like the young lady was talking about operating costs and your shell and TI and things of that type of breakout. And one thing I wanted to note is on your OA, there are no pen and ink changes. So if you're reviewing the OA and you say, oh no, this is wrong, you can't just scratch it out and put your initials. If you have a question or issue, you need to contact your GSA representative because it's not going to be honored. They're just going to look past that. Now we're going to go on to the building shell. Okay. I got it now. Can anybody tell me what constitutes the building shell? Anybody want to take a stab or a guess? Yes, sir.
They said it in one of the
Yeah.
ceiling lights.
In an open office layout. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I saw something interesting to it include water fountains.
So, okay, so just let me get into what it is. The building shell is kind of like the complete enveloping structure of the building. That's going to include your windows, your base building, your electrical, your elevators, your common area, those type of things. That's what your shell is. And in tenant areas, there's also shell space. So your wall board, any kind of common corridors. So if you have agency A on one side, agency B on another side, that common corridor is shell space, which you both use to access your space. Your suspended acoustical tiles, as well as the concrete floor. That is all shell cost. Okay. Yes. So in the commercial market industry, you hear cold lit shell a lot, but for here we use a warm lit shell. This is just a picture representation. And so because we include HVAC, so it's not going to be, we include your electrical service to your space, not through your space. So it's not going to be a space that doesn't have heating. There's going to be heating for open office layout. Is that, and Ava, could you write that down so maybe I can get you a more detailed version of how the two differ? You're very welcome. And here you can see the reference that I was talking about at the bottom. So to find out more about building shell for leases, it would be 2.4.1, and for federal space, 3.5.1. And you'll find that on a lot of the slides. Yes, sir.
What's the guideline on the wall?
So for
Walls are-
the base building structure, that's going to be your wall board on the exterior perimeter and the interior core walls. And it's also going to be the common corridor that I mentioned without gypsum board.
Common corridor. What is the common, what's
The common corridor,
interior core wall?
so the common corridor,
Around the elevator?
yes. There was another.
What indicates that those are exclusive to you? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying those items are a part of shell.
What I'm saying, but I'm saying if you have a whole, part of a floor or a whole floor, that's.
Part is still shell.
Okay.
I'm sorry? Studio? Oh, exterior. Yes, I'm sorry, ma'am. Yes. Okay.
Now, the thing is on there, you have something about electrical service, okay? Is that just one main port coming in?
No, but the thing to remember, no, because depending upon the size of your space, there are rules about how many, electrical outlets you need. But the thing to remember, it's to the open office area space. It's not through your space. So if you set up partitions and you need extra outlets, then that becomes the TI cost. Correct. Okay, so continuing with the building shell, we have to use the building shell definition in its entirety. This helps with consistent application across our regions. Building standards and design guides, however, do not automatically mean something is a part of shell. There may be a building standard that says you have to have a certain type of entry suite door. That does not make it a shell or TI item. They may say you have to have a certain type of flooring. In the common area, that would be shell, and in your space, that would be TI. Building standards do not determine whether items are shell or TI. And the other thing, BSAC or building specific security items are not part of shell. They're not part of TI. They're actually their own separate line item on the rent bill.
Are they included in the OA?
Yes. It's just that they're not classified as shell or TI. There's a separate line, BSAC. So now, as I mentioned, when you talk about your shell rent and lease space, that's going to be a pass-through of the underlying PBS lease contract shell rent, and it may have step rents. Again, lessors have to use that shell definition in its entirety when they do their request for lease proposal to develop their shell rate. Now, DID drawings, design intent drawings, can be included in the shell for leases. It's optional. It's not mandatory, it's optional. And as well as we typically include cyclical paint and carpet replacement as part of the lease cost, as part of the shell cost in leases, okay? In federal space, the shell rent is going to be based on your FAR or fair annual rent appraisal. And that's going to be done every 10 years. So at a minimum, that fair annual rent appraisal is going to be done every 10 years. The one caveat to that is general storage space. It's going to be 50% of that shell rate. Now, we are not talking about items in the Pricing Desk Guide 5th edition, but one important thing to note that in that, going forward, TFC or tenant floor cut space will also be at that 50% shell rate. And so a TFC is when you have an opening above an occupant space. The most common example would be like an atrium that, which if they didn't have that open space, it would otherwise be usable space, okay? So I did want to note that. The other thing, just some benefits to having that 10-year shell rate. Customers have a rate that reflects their long-term occupancy, which usually is reflected in lower rental rates. It provides consistency as well as budget predictability, and it aligns with the long-term tendencies of the commercial market. And it also helps lower administrative costs, both for GSA and for the tenant as well. So going back to the 50% storage of GNS, I wanted to show this because what we have gotten, I mean, as you can see, there's a steel beam going through the space. I don't know if you can see it, but up here they have some HVAC or something going on in the ceiling. This space is not built out to be usable office space. Now, just because I have a room in a basement, maybe it's a small window, it's kind of dark, and I shove all my boxes in there, that does not make it GNS space. It's not the way that the room is being used. It's really the way that's built out. This cannot be used as office space. And in that case, you would receive that 50% office shell.
Would you would certainly get a reduced rent?
50%.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Let me keep track of my time here. Okay, and now we're going to talk about tenant improvements, TIs, what we typically call them. So the thing to remember about shell and TI is there's kind of like a wall or a barrier there. Funds for shell cannot be used for TI, and vice versa. Funds for TI cannot be used for shell. So if PBS is constructing a building shell for less than the approved or authorized budget amount, that savings cannot be then taken toward the TI. It has to be reprogrammed in for other projects, but it's not available to defray any type of TI cost. Okay? Conversely, if the building shell exceeds the project, the TI allowance cannot be used to cover that amount. So you're going to have to look at other ways to make up that difference, maybe seeking additional funding, examining the specifications, or other ways to lower that cost. Now, the one caveat you will find in pricing, there's oftentimes a caveat, okay? So the one caveat in this instance is shell funds can be moved to TI allowance in a prospectus level project. That's only when A, the agency agrees to it, because that's going to increase your rent, and two, only after all other remedies have been looked at. It's kind of like a last resort. So value reengineering, de-scoping, it should really be like a last ditch effort to save the project.
Do you supply for federal and commercial?
Federal,
All federal.
yes.
So,
Yes.
firstly, on a perspective level, if shell costs exceed and the agency pay part of the amortized
TI, it only goes it goes one way. You can take that, you can take shell funds to TI. You can't take the TI funds back to shell. Is that what you're asking?
I'll say no more.
Well, if you want to give me a more, or Ab up here, yeah, okay. Okay. So when we talk about tenant improvements, these are really the finishes and fixtures that take your space from your shell condition to a usable condition. And you, the agency, you're going to elect how those finishes are used, as long as obviously they're functional and compliant with any type of building code standards, okay? And again, just to reiterate, the existence of building standards does not mean that those items become part of shell. So this is a good example I like to show of shell versus TI. And back to when I was talking about the example of the floor, you have this terrazzo striped tile up here in the common area. That is shell. But once you cross the suite entry doors for the agency, it becomes tenant TI. So just because the building says, oh, you have to have this floor, doesn't mean that it's no longer TI. It's in your space, it's flooring, it is still TI. So when we talk about the tenant improvement allowance, it's really the funding source that enables your space to be built out. And it has two components, the general and the custom. And we will get into that a little bit later on in some other slides. Really, the purpose of it is to provide you, the agency, with flexibility and the option to save money. If you don't use all your TI, your rent is going to be lower. And this is commonplace in the commercial real estate market. It also allows both PBS and the lessor to budget more reliably. And even more importantly, it helps us and tenant agencies comply with appropriations law as well as the OMB requirement, which sets limits on how much can be amortized into the rent. God bless you. So as I mentioned, you, the tenant, get to elect how that space is finished out. And if you don't spend all your money on your TI allowance, then yes, your rent will be lower. However, if you don't use that full allowance, you cannot bank it for later. So let's say you have a 10-year OA and you didn't use all your TI, your initial build out. You can't come to us 3 years later and say, oh, you know what? I do want to use that to get some new carpet. It's gone. Once that initial build out is done, it is gone. And it can only be used to pay for real items or items which become real property when attached or fixed to the building. Some people question, well, how does that happen? And a really good example I like to use is when we talk about shelving. So if you look at the shelving system with the brown panels, this is real property. And it's real property because even though the shelving doesn't have fixed aisles, but it's mounted on top of a system that the anchors are kind of grouted in the floor. So that's not going anywhere anytime soon. That would be real property. Take a different shelving system. On the bottom, that's actually personal property. It's a high density shelving unit which sits on top of the floor. It's something we can pick up and easily move. So it's important to make the distinction between real property and personal property because you cannot use your TI allowance to pay for personal property. Here are some other examples of what your TI cannot fund. These are all personal property. Furniture, microwave, phone headsets, television, artwork. Again, this is not the complete list. For a complete list, you can see the pricing desk guide that's referenced in the bottom corner. Now, there is a program called FIT that is encompassed or housed in FAS, and they do have funds which allow you to purchase furniture and IT, and that's in connection with a program called the Total Workspace Development Program. But you cannot use your TI for that. For these. So how do we really use this TI allowance? It kind of depends on where you are, what type of where you are in your occupancy. There's 4 different scenarios that I just want to briefly go over. The first is initial occupancy. So new space, new tenant. You get the full TI allowance in this case. Here, though, you cannot buy down the general allowance because this is first generation space. Nobody has been in it before. But you can buy down your custom. Remember, there's general allowance and custom allowance. In first generation space, you cannot buy down your general allowance, but you can buy down your custom allowance by lump sum. This has to be done before the amortization schedule of the TIs is established, okay? But you do have that option in initial occupancies. The second scenario is backfill occupancies. You'll also hear this referred to as relet space or second generation space. And that's when you are essentially moving in a place that has TIs from a different agency. So agency moved out, all the TIs are left, you come in and you're going to be in this space now. In that instance, you can receive the full TI allowance, but it's subject to the availability of cost. Okay. The important thing to remember here, however, is a second generation space, you can buy down the general allowance. But there's one really important caveat. You have to make sure that you are keeping most of the TIs that are in place. You cannot significantly remodel or change what is already there. So the example that I like to give is if you came into the space and you said, oh no, I need new flooring, this office is too big, do it half of that, I need to make these 2 offices, change this hallway, that is substantially changing that space. In that case, you would not be able to buy down your general allowance. But if you came in and said, you know what, I think I just need some new carpet here in this entryway, that might be a situation where it qualifies and you would be able to buy down that general allowance.
Does a buy down result in
lower rent? That is why you would want to do so, yes. The other 2 scenarios, the first one is mid-occupancy, also called post-initial occupancy. So same OA term, same space. I'm in there 6 years, and then I decide I want some new carpet again. And so at this point, that's typically going to be funded by the tenant. We are under no obligation at this point mid-occupancy to provide that allowance to you. However, subject to the availability of funds, a full or partial allowance could be provided. This is very atypical. It does not happen often, but it is possible. And the last situation is when you have a continuing occupancy. So I've been in my space, my 10-year OA is up, I'm going to stay in the space another 10 years. So same tenant, same space, but a new OA. In this case, a lot of agencies will be like, I just need a refresher. Let's maybe paint the walls. And in lease space, you're going to get the full TI allowance. And in your federal space, you're going to get full or partial allowance. But again, it's going to be subject to the availability of funds. Okay. So now we're going to get into the general allowance and the custom allowance. So your general allowance takes that shell space with just the concrete floor, open office layout, takes it to kind of like a generic, a vanilla office space. Okay, and we get to that number because it is set nationally and indexed to local construction costs. So currently it's $38.95. Washington, D.C. has a local construction index of 1. So yes. So it is reviewed annually, but that does not mean that it will change. And in fact, it will be, assuming that the pricing desk guide is approved as is, it will be increasing in the 5th edition. Okay. And so somewhere like New York would have LCC greater than 1. Somewhere like Hawaii or California or LA as well, where someone like Oklahoma or Nebraska, it will be under 1, obviously because the cost of labor and materials is going to be more in a major metropolitan city. And what it covers are things like doors, partitioning, and your carpet and your electrical outlet and telephone outlets, excuse me. Now, when you talk about the customization allowance, that then takes that plain vanilla space to something that is specifically designed to meet your agency's mission. It's not intended to eliminate the need for RWA payments, and it's also not adjusted. And that is because, as we will see on this next slide, the customization allowance is actually a percentage of the general allowance. And the general allowance has already been adjusted, so there's no need to do that calculation twice. Some examples of custom allowance would be any type of millwork, maybe an upgraded ventilation system, private bathrooms, that type of thing would be what your custom allowance is used for. So here, this is just kind of the math that walks you through how you get to your tier allowance. Of course, we have a tool that does this process, but just to show you, we create a series of customization tiers 0 through 6. So everyone is assigned a tier. I don't think anyone has 0, it's 1 through 6. And each tier is equal to 10% of the value of the general allowance. So let's take that $38.95 and you would multiply it by the local construction index of whatever city you were in. That number gives you your general allowance. Then let's say you're a tier 3. So you take your general allowance, multiply that by 30%. That will give you your custom allowance. You add those two numbers together, and that's going to be your whole TI allowance. Okay? So way back when pricing was first, new pricing, it's not really new anymore, was first established, GSA took an average of what each agency used to build out typical space for them. And that is how they came up with how the agencies were assigned their tiers. I have seen in some instances where an agency has felt like that tier is not high enough. And in those cases, the agency submitted a report, if you will, or a report with backup information detailing why the current tier was not sufficient. And I have seen it increase, but not a lot.
The tier can always be adjusted.
On a specific project, yes. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the amortization both in leases and in federal space. So in a lease, the term is usually going to be the firm term of the lease. And there's 2 rules for when we talk about how long that amortization period can be, okay? The first is it can't exceed the economic life of the improvement. And the second is it can't exceed the term of the OA. But again, this is pricing, so we have a caveat. And in this exception, lessors with our agreement and the tenant agency's agreement can actually set the amortization term beyond the lease firm term. But they have to agree that, you know, if we decide to leave and exercise our termination rights early, there's not going to be a penalty for us. Okay. Again, you could have multiple amortization periods if you're having phased projects, and the interest rate on a lease amortization is going to be negotiated between the successful offeror and PBS. Did I see a hand? No. In owned space, it's somewhat similar, but the standard amortization term is 10 years. In courtrooms and chambers, it can go up to 20 years. And again, the two rules: one, it cannot exceed the economic life of the improvement, and the amortization term cannot exceed the term of the OA. Similar to leases, you can have multiple amortization periods if you're having a phased project. And here the interest rate is set annually. It's the 10-year Treasury plus 12.5 basis points. So these next two slides are two charts that I pulled from the guide. I'm not going to read everything verbatim, but I thought this was good to include for when the presentation gets uploaded. And they really detail, based on your timing, what lump sum options you have to pay your TI. So the four categories that it talks about is at assignment inception, anytime you decide to release space back to PBS, basically anytime during the OA, and the last situation is really talking about a forced move situation. Okay. So now we're going to move on to operating costs. So in a lease, it is a direct pass-through of the lease contract costs for standard services to that customer agency, and we typically escalate it by the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. And in federal space, it's going to be based on a market appraisal, and it's reset every 10 years. And that's escalated by the OMB inflation factor. One caveat for this, in the 5th edition, again, assuming that it is published or approved as is, in a single tenant, federally owned building only for Fed space, operating costs can be based on actuals instead of the federal appraisal. So our utilities in the lease. In a lease, you're going to get consistent heating or cooling for one shift, a minimum of 10 operating hours. Obviously, it doesn't include the time it takes to get up to the temperature you need it to be at. It's consistent heating for 10 hours. And the lease actually can provide HVAC hours in excess of that. What it really depends on is what the standard is in that market. But that doesn't mean it can be 24 hours. So if it's standard 12 hours, then that would be okay. But you can't say, oh, the standard is 24 hours of HVAC. Outside of that, reimbursement is still required for HVAC outside of normal business hours. And that's going to be specified in the lease. Again, the one caveat we have here is when we have server rooms that are less than 500 square feet. And in those instances, the HVAC utility services are incorporated as part of the standard operating cost component of the lease rents. And the reason behind this was to make the requirement for the small computer rooms more in line of what we have been seeing in the market for lease space. However, that doesn't mean that if you have a server room greater than 500, you can kind of segment out 500 square feet of space and say, oh, this is going to be 24 hours included in the rent. You can't do that. It's only for total server rooms that are less than 500 square feet. Our utilities and own space, again, 10 hours of consistent heating or cooling, and the property manager or building manager should be consulting the tenants in the building to come up with an agreed upon time of what those 10 hours are going to be. And anything outside of those 10 hours have to be reimbursed via RWA. So, yes, It's considered above standard service, and so therefore it cannot be included as part of the rent. It has to be a separate line item, and that's why we have to take that money via RWA. Unless you are in a federal building with a single tenant where it's going to be based on your actual operating costs, yes. Custodial services. You can see they're actually very similar. They differ with the window washings and the carpet cleaning. In federal space, PBS is supposed to provide cleaning standard that's comparable to what you would see in the commercial market. And again, the regional property manager should be discussing what time that cleaning is going to take place with the tenants in the building, and whatever the majority decides is what should be the hours, standard cleaning hours. And okay. And the standard is set based on the requirements, as I said, of the majority of the tenants. In lease space, the lease contract has a section that actually outlines what the specific standard custodial services are that the lessor is supposed to include in those operating costs. Yes.
Nowadays,
Mm-hmm.
can the agency live?
Sub-metered, typically no. It's not as, it's very difficult to break out. And most buildings don't have the type of technology to be able to sub-meter. I do know it's been talked about for years, but as of this point, we do not have the ability to break it out per agency. Okay. So, I think just based on industry standard, most of the time when you have unless it's like, I don't know, maybe like an FBI or something has to run 24/7, in the market, you're going to see a standard of 10 business hours. But if you're looking for, if they what? I'm sorry. So you mean include it all in rent? Is that what you're saying, instead of having? I'm going to capture that question and get you a more of an explanation than get right now. Okay. Tenant agency rights. Oh dear. Okay. Prior to contract execution, you have a no fault cancellation. Okay. After contract, but prior to moving in, you're going to be liable for the lesser of two costs in a lease if you decide you don't want to stay here. And that is the lease buyout cost or the 16-month rental obligation had you stayed in the space, plus any unamortized TIs. In owned space, you're going to owe the total project cost incurred. Now, if PBS executes a tenant agency requested service that's not included in the PBS fee and we don't get reimbursed up front, we do reserve the right to get that money or get that reimbursement, regardless of whether the project was canceled prior to contract execution or after contract execution or even after occupancy. So now back to the fee that we were discussing earlier. In cancelable space, it's 7%. In non-cancelable space, it's 5%. PBS makes that decision. It's based on very specific criteria. And once that decision has been made, it should not change for the duration of your OA. And you should see that designation on your first pro forma OA that you get. You cannot volunteer to have non-cancelable space to get a lower fee. And in that line, this is what we are looking for when we try to determine if something should be non-cancelable space. Whether it's a remote location, if it has a special purpose or build out, which would make it financially really difficult to retrofit for a typical office space, if you have a lease construction or unusual term, and really any lack of a realistic federal need for anybody other than you to be in the space, all these factors are going to be considered when we make that non-cancelable determination. Now, we say non-cancelable, which means you think you can't return it. You could return it, but you will still pay your rent. You will still pay your operating rent, your TIs, security charges, joint use. So in essence, the space really is not returnable. The only situation where that would change is if we did find a backfill tenant, in which case, to the extent that they cover your rent, that's what you wouldn't have to pay. Yes. 5 minutes remaining. You want to see how fast I can talk? Okay. So within 4 months, tenant agencies can release space back to us, provided, obviously, you no longer need the space. The space is not designated as non-cancelable. The tenant is in the space for at least 16 months. That only applies to leases. And the space is in marketable blocks. So really quickly, when we talk about marketable blocks, we're really talking about location, use, size, and contiguous use, or contiguous space. So here, that is not accessible from the gray common corridor. So obviously, if you wanted to return it, you would need to pay to have some kind of access to that space. If we had a janitor's closet, that would be too small. We could not take only a janitor closet back. If we had red blocks all around this floor, we couldn't take that back. That's scattered. That's not going to be something that we could market to another agency. So that's really what we talk about when we talk about marketability.
The last slide.
Yes.
You didn't, there was no, yeah. Okay, when you identify the 16-month lease in the VOA term.
How do I get back to my present? There we go. This.
Does that matter at all, or depending on the term of the lease, or just is it?
No. So you read my mind. Just getting to that. So we have a return of space mailbox where you submit all your requests. And it's very important that you tell us as soon as you know that you want to return the space, even if it's just approximate date, because if we have early lease termination rights, that could reduce your 16-month requirement. If we have any benefit from termination rights, we're going to pass that along to you.
What I'm saying though is this: okay, let's say I come in on a five-year term lease versus a 10-year term lease, full term, firm term. There is no
5-year firm.
Yes.
Okay.
Or a straight 10-year.
Okay.
There's, I can exercise that right, the same right.
As long as you've been in this, yes, as long as you've been in the space for 16 months, okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. So again, you can find the pricing desk guide online. If you go to gsa.gov and Google rent pricing policy, several links should pop up. In conclusion, I hope that this training was able to give you kind of an introduction to pricing. But I definitely encourage you, in addition to your GSA contacts, to check out the guide. If you can't sleep one night, maybe pop it open. It might help. So with that, that's going to conclude my presentation. I'm not sure.
There will be a follow-up after the conference that will have the link to all of the slide decks that will be recorded every breakout session today.
Yes.
When we talk about backfill space and allowances, and it's to key to GSA available funds. I've never been anywhere
where they actually have the funds. Yes. Yes. You're right on the money. Yeah, I can count on one hand maybe the times that I've seen it happen. But if for some reason we got this windfall of money, it could happen. We can dream, can't we? Yes.
People arrive at work at 6 and they stay till 6. So why can't GSA adjust?
So in that case, that kind of 12 hours working with the lease, that would be acceptable because it's not straight 10 hours. If the market is that you have 12 or maybe 13, lease have to be okay. But in federal space, you are correct. It's 10-hour standard. Victoria, yeah, if I could capture that question and maybe get some more back.